as we celebrate this Sunday, the Feast of the Holy Family, there are a lot of clues in our liturgy to help us think about God's plan, God's will in our lives. Because I know it's very tempting. Sometimes I hear people struggling with God's will as if God's plan was a bulldozer that was coming and it was gonna just make everything happen God's way. And the best we could do is not lock our knees as we wait for the bulldozer to run over us. But that's really not at all how God's plan, God's will unfolds in our lives. And against the backdrop of chaos, of original sin, of loss and pain and struggle, God is constantly inviting us into love. But the fact is, every choice we make freely, because God has given us this freedom, will shift what that love ultimately looks like. And as we think about family life, sometimes our lives are blessed and in ways that make us very happy as many grandchildren gather around our table and the love of our life is still healthy and at our side and everything unfolds beautifully. But this is also a good day to remember with great love those who lost a spouse, those whose best efforts at marriage ended up with blended families, those who raise their children without the support of a loving spouse, those who don't speak anymore with their children and don't see their grandchildren, right? These are all also outcomes in life. And to know that God's plan for us in all of these outcomes is one of blessing and love, not the bulldozer that got us to where we are. Bulldozers should usually be associated with the devil who drives them and with the sin that gives them fuel, whether that's original sin or somebody else's or our own. But in the midst of those struggles, God's plan, God's love in my life, the possibilities are continually opened anew. I can only imagine that Anna, when she lost her husband after 7 years, almost certainly without children, now in a society where women had no voice, couldn't manage property, she had to make some choices. She could have sat in her home and waited for God's will, but God's will is very seldom that we should sit in our home and wait. And so in prayer, she found her way to the temple where she spent half of a century. And in that living out of God's plan for her, in prayer, in the temple, she found a voice that her contemporaries didn't have. And she was regarded as a prophetess, as one, while her feet were planted here, she wasn't limited to what was now. She could hope for and see something opening in the future. And ultimately, her voice in proclaiming Messiah is recorded for the ages to come because she followed God's will. But that was a plan that she was intimately involved in choosing. And it was a plan that God continued offering her, even when tragedy and pain and loss and grief came upon her life. And for Mary, today to hear from Simeon of a sword of sorrow that would pierce her heart, I guess she could have just sat back and waited for this bulldozer to ride her over. But God's plan is almost never that we sit back and wait. And so as God invited her into a plan of salvation, we'll see later that she's the one who sets the gears in motion for this sword to pierce her heart, because she longs for the love and truth that will ultimately also be a source of pain and break the heart that so loves and desires good for her children. Like that in our lives, there are a lot of things that happen, many of them not God's will, because he made commandments telling people not to do the things that got us here. And yet, wherever we find ourselves, in whatever dark alley that appears to have no exit, right? That God still is offering a plan. That God is still offering the possibility of love and meaning. And in our families, that God is still inviting us into a place like the Holy Family, not without troubles or without being in exile or without being afraid or without being hungry. No, all of those things Jesus knew as he grew. And he knew most likely the pain of loss as he sat with his mother who lost her husband. Like all of those things we find still in our lives, but in all of them still an opening, a possibility, a plan, God's plan, God's meaning and direction and hope that we can choose. And whatever our choices are, to know that God won't stop offering us where we find ourselves, a plan, a direction, a hope, until we all one day share with Mary and Joseph and Jesus, that great family of our Heavenly Father.